Racist cops trap black woman. But her dog was trained for war. In a country that prides itself on freedom, sometimes just being a black woman walking her dog along the beach is enough to make the whole system feel threatened. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Late autumn in Santa Clara painted the sky with a warm bronze hue tinged with indigo, as if the entire atmosphere were blurring beneath the gaze of someone just waking from a long slumber. The distant Pacific Ocean wasn't roaring. It whispered, like the voice of time itself, a sound Hilda Anderson had listened to for most of her life. She stepped out of the small, gray-painted wooden house and clipped the leash onto Valor, a 35-kilogram Belgian Malinois who had served in 3 campaigns in the Middle East and had been trained from puppyhood by Naomi, her late wife. Hilda was 68 years old, a linguistics professor with 30 years of teaching at UC Berkeley. She had authored over 20 academic works on semantics and race studies. But in this quiet coastal town, people simply knew her as the black lady with the big dog. Her career, titles, and years of scholarship dissolved into the air the moment she stepped onto the dirt path by the sea, a place where only 3% of residents were people of color, most of them janitors or migrant workers. The ocean breeze tangled through the thick khaki coat she had worn every winter since Naomi passed. The scent of salt, rotting pine wood, and dried leather from the leash blended together, awakening a memory she thought was long buried. Sunday mornings, when Naomi, statuesque like a bronze sculpture, would command Valor with a voice sharp, often deep, like a blade being unsheathed. And that dog, he never hesitated. But today, Valor walked slower, not because of age, but because of alertness. Hilda could feel the change in tension through the leash. The wind carried something unusual. Not humidity, but something else. The scent of warning. As they neared the bend by the cliffs where eucalyptus trees bowed toward the sea, Hilda halted. A standard-issue white and blue Ford Explorer police vehicle was parked diagonally across the path. No siren. No flashing lights. The engine idled, low and steady, like a predator's breath as it waits to strike. The tinted windows concealed whoever was inside, but Hilda knew someone was watching, not looking. Watching. Throughout her life, Hilda had learned to distinguish a courteous glance from a gaze meant to invade, and the eyes, hidden though they were behind the smoked glass, were enough to make her feel as though every inch of her skin was being scanned. She had done nothing wrong, just a black woman walking with a loyal dog. But in this society, mere existence can sometimes be seen as provocation. Santa Clara's crime rate was so low that the local news often went weeks without a crime section. So what was that police car doing on a dirt road along the cliffs, where no one walked but Hilda and Valor? She knew this wasn't a random patrol. No one parks with such provocation, engine running, doors shut, unmoving, unless they have a reason. In her mind flashed a line from last year's census report. Only 2.7% of Santa Clara's population was African American or multiracial. And in this beachfront neighborhood, she was the only one. She kept her breathing steady, continued walking, never looking back. Valor walked closer, his shoulder brushing her shin, not out of fear, but affirmation. Something had shifted, and both of them felt it. Hilda didn't yet know that this would be just the first of many days where silence would be wielded as a weapon. But from that moment, she knew one thing for certain. Someone was counting her steps, not to protect her, but to erase them. And she, drawing on all the pain and memory she had carried, made a decision. She would not let that happen quietly. It started with one time, then two. Then it became a string of consecutive days. That cruiser, license plate S-7821, a 2021 Ford Explorer, began infiltrating every part of Hilda Anderson's daily life like a uniformed ghost. Still in the standard white and blue, still no sirens, no announcements, no one stepping out. Only a pair of eyes behind tinted glass, and an engine humming with the rhythm of an unspoken threat. On the third day, the car was parked in front of the pharmacy where Hilda usually picked up her blood pressure medication. 6 minutes after she entered, it slowly pulled away. Not hurried, just long enough for her to know she was being watched, but not long enough to prove anything unlawful. On the 5th day, it appeared by the laundromat near the farmer's market, right when she arrived to pick up her clothes. By the 8th day, it showed up near the cafe on 3rd Avenue, where she used to spend Monday mornings reading and writing postcards to former students. Soon enough, Hilda realized that they, or someone within the police department, were tracking her routine. Not openly, not officially, but steadily and ruthlessly. It reached its peak on the 11th day when she saw the cruiser parked motionless at the mouth of the alley leading to her home, barely 30 meters from her gray wooden gate. Inside the car were 3 faces that had now become the embodiment of silent intimidation. Sergeant Logan Price, about 42 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, a commanding figure, shoes polished without a single scuff. He always wore the expression of someone pretending to be decent, lips smiling, but eyes like gold-plated needles, gleaming, beautiful, and piercing. In every encounter, Logan never rolled down the window, but Hilda knew he saw everything, and remembered it all. Beside him was Officer Elias Carter, about 35, white, buzz cut, always tapping his baton's handle with his fingers, like keeping tempo to a song only he could hear. He leaned against the car door, eyes unfocused, but his grip on the weapon tight, like he was waiting for a signal to strike. In the back sat rookie Matt Riley, the youngest face, around 25, fair skin, slightly curly blonde hair, always trying to sit straight with his hands on his thighs like it was his first training day. But his eyes darted constantly, full of conflict between fear and mimicry. Clearly, Riley hadn't yet absorbed the dangerous form of power his seniors were modeling, but he also lacked the courage to break away from it. Hilda began to change tactics. Instead of following a fixed walking schedule, she varied the time, sometimes early morning, sometimes late afternoon. She stuck to routes with security cameras from nearby businesses, the grocery store she had once donated books to, the sandwich shop where a freshman student worked part-time. All now became her indirect escort system. She wore a sports watch with GPS and recorded her daily time, location, and route. She took photos of the car each time it appeared, logged the license plate, time, even the number of times Elias tapped his baton on his knee, a habit clearly not accidental. But what suffocated her most wasn't their presence, it was the perfect silence. No one said a word. No one made contact, no search warrant, no warnings. They were just there. And that presence, with badges, with weapons, with authority, was a deafening sound that needed no volume. Once, she tried walking closer, just to see if there'd be a reaction. Elias tilted his head with a smile, but said nothing. Logan removed his sunglasses, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, then put them back on. Riley lowered his gaze. Then they drove off. Hilda understood. That silence was a tactic, a form of psychological predation. Because if she spoke up, filed a complaint, what would it say? I was looked at for too long. I was parked near too many times. No insults, no specific actions, not a single word violating any code. And that was the most terrifying part. In a system where violence had learned how not to lift a hand, fear had become part of the machinery. And Hilda, despite being a linguist by trade, now found herself struggling with the language of silence, where there were no words, but overwhelming pressure. The threat didn't come with a shout. It came by forcing her to ask every day, is today the day they'll do more than just watch? And that question was never meaningless. Millbrook nights, as always, were silent and cold. But on the outskirts of town, inside an abandoned grain barn behind the old McAllister farm, deserted since 1998 after a suspicious fire, the flicker of a small flashlight danced across rotting walls and bundles of hay stacked chest high. There was no music, no greetings, only the musty scent of time and the smell of engine oil from the boots of Carl Dixon, still caked with dried mud. Joshua Briggs stood in the center of the room, in front of a wooden table cobbled together from an old stall door. He wore an old military jacket, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes scanning each man in turn. On the table lay a printed map of Millbrook, the 2012 edition issued by the Land Council, marked in red pen at 4 locations: Gavin's Farm, Grace Chapel Evangelical Church, Frida Chen's Bakery, the only Asian-owned business in town, and the football field, where 2 black families had recently enrolled their children. "He's putting down roots," Joshua said, voice raspy. "He's not here to test out a few months of living. 47 acres, reinforced log cabin, bulletproof doors, autonomous power systems. This is an outpost." Ray Peters, the auto parts shop owner on Main Street, crouched in the far left corner, flipping a Glock 23 over and over in his hands, safety off. "Who is he?" Ray asked. "I heard he used to be military." Frank Miller, president of First Southern Union Bank, a man still trying to look respectable in a place that had abandoned pretense, raised a beer to his lips, but didn't drink. "I looked into it," Frank said quietly. "No credit history, no debt, no mortgage. He paid for the entire property in a single transfer from an account in Fayetteville, linked to a military fund. Tier 3 security clearance." "Delta Force," Carl Dixon muttered. "My brother-in-law's in the National Guard. Says those Delta guys aren't regular soldiers. They're killers." Joshua smiled. It held no humor at all. "Killer or not, he's still a black man in the center of our town. If he holds his ground here, then in 3 years, he will bring 2 cousins. In 5 years, this town will become a transit hub. In 10 years, your daughters will be in the same class as his kids. That's what you want?" No one answered, but no one left. Joshua walked toward the back of the room, where a yellowed whiteboard stood. He sketched a quick layout: Gavin's house, entry road, main doors, backyard. "We don't need to burn the house down yet. He's a soldier. He'll react like a soldier. But everyone has a limit. We take his sleep first, then his sense of direction, then his faith." Ray nodded. "I'll handle the tires. Slash him next time he drives into town." Carl added, "I know the pizza delivery kid. He can call at midnight, change his voice, and make threats. Then hang up." Frank hesitated. I don't want to do anything illegal." Joshua stared at him so long that the air seemed to still. "Frank, who's funded this group for the past 15 years? Who signs off on low-interest loans for members here? If you walk out of here and act like you didn't hear a thing, the FBI will call you the ringleader. But if you stay, you'll be protected, just like always." Frank said nothing, then nodded, barely. None of them knew that, just beyond the nearby hay bales, once used to shelter old harvesters, a pair of elderly eyes were watching. Betty Hawthorne hadn't come out of curiosity. She was looking for Ginger, her cat, missing since yesterday. But what she found wasn't fur. It was true. Betty clutched her old phone in both hands, battery at just 12%. She took 3 photos, recorded 38 seconds of audio. She wasn't sure if it would be enough, but she knew one thing. A storm was building, and this time, no one had the right to stay silent. Gavin Johnson had lived in places where there were no laws, only survival. Places where gunfire gave no warning, and trust was a luxury. So when the cross appeared in front of his porch, he didn't call the police. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a dual-encrypted SSD drive, plugged it into his laptop, and launched a familiar interface, a perimeter surveillance software he had once used while stationed in Al-Hadar, Iraq. Since the first day he arrived in Millbrook, Gavin had built his security ring. 4 4K infrared cameras were discreetly mounted around his property's perimeter, camouflaged with matte-painted wooden panels. A vibration sensor was installed beneath the front porch floor, capable of detecting human footsteps from 3 meters away. Even the doorbell was a modified version. It didn't chime, but every touch triggered a photo that was instantly sent to his phone and backed up to a secondary server in Virginia. Gavin didn't panic when the black Chevrolet pickup passed his house for the 4th time that week. He simply noted it in his logbook. License plate QK 98423. Time 7:48 a.m. Wednesday. Speed 12 miles per hour, well below the 25 miles per hour limit. Through the camera, he identified the driver as Carl Dixon. The man never looked directly at the house, but the reflection in his side mirror didn't lie. The next day, at the farmer's market nearly 4 miles from his house, Gavin found a 6-centimeter steel spike embedded straight into his front right tire. He didn't get angry, didn't complain. He just crouched down, took a picture, and called a tow truck. While waiting, he pulled out his phone and pointed the lens at the cafe across the street. 3 men were sitting there, among them Ray Peters, laughing smugly. None of them knew that in just a few days, their photos would appear in a file labeled Passive Interaction Surveillance Pattern, Millbrook. Gavin wasn't preparing for a stroll. He was preparing for a campaign. Back home, Gavin powered on the large screen mounted on his wall, what he called the tactical board. A digital map of the town was marked with red dots, locations of unusual movement, recurring time patterns, approach directions, and types of vehicles. Every potential target had its file, travel habits, social connections, suspicious affiliations. What Gavin had built wasn't just a defense system. It was a preemptive counter-strike network. That night, under the dim glow of his desk lamp, Gavin opened the file named Briggs. He was a different breed, not one of the drunk loudmouths on the street. He was dangerous precisely because he didn't need to shout. He manipulated, controlled, and steered the atmosphere like a silent conductor. Gavin had encountered men like him in the Balkans, those who seemed painfully ordinary on the surface, but trailed a wake of ethnic violence and corpses behind them. He added one more line to the file. Briggs, strategist, capable of organizing, does not act alone. From that moment, Gavin altered his routine. He never stepped outside without a firearm. Every night before bed, he checked all 4 main doors, 3 escape routes, 4 cameras, and 2 telescopic periscopes. He never lay down without knowing exactly how many movements had occurred within a 1-mile radius. To those other men, Gavin was just an outsider. But they had forgotten one thing. A man who survives 20 years in death zones is no prey. They had forgotten that sometimes the creature they think they're hunting is the one that strikes at the predator's throat. In Millbrook, the one being watched had started watching back. And in that calm, silent night, a veteran, without a uniform, without insignia, officially stepped back into the role he knew best. The predator. Miles Carter, 16 years old, never imagined that the birthday drone he'd just received from his mother would accidentally turn him into the chronicler of a defining moment in his town's history. He had only planned to test a sunset shot for his documentary project in Santa Clara North High School's media skills class. A shot of the coastline, a few swaying branches, and some twilight to accompany a voiceover he hadn't even written yet. But as people often say, history doesn't schedule appointments, nor does it check whether its witness is ready. As Miles steered the drone around the row of oak trees behind Mission Trail Church, the camera accidentally caught sight of an empty path below, and there, like a silent yet riveting film, unfolded a scene that took his breath away. An elderly black woman, whom he recognized as Professor Hilda Anderson, who had once given a lecture at his school on the history of language, was standing face to face with 3 police officers. No one was speaking. No one was being physically aggressive. But every muscle was taut, every gaze heavy like an unspoken accusation. Valor, the Malinois by her side, was growling softly, standing between her and an officer who had his hand raised toward her as if to make contact. Miles couldn't hear the sound from that distance, but the body language said it all. Something was being tested. Not the law, not security, but the boundaries of the right to exist without being seen as a threat. Miles stopped the drone at 22 meters altitude, locked the frame at a 50mm focal length, and began to record. He didn't zoom in, didn't shake the shot, didn't add effects. It was just a lens, unfeeling but wholly loyal to the truth. The entire encounter lasted 3 minutes and 12 seconds. There were no gunshots, no screams, but every look, every twitch of a hand, every quiet movement of the cruiser brimmed with violence. When he got home, Miles skipped dinner. He uploaded the video to his computer and watched it 5 times in a row. Inside him grew a strange feeling, not quite anger, but a kind of silent shock, as if a curtain had fallen, and what lay behind it wasn't suspicion, but certainty. He chose not to edit anything, no soundtrack, no commentary. He simply titled it, "She Didn't Bark. She Just Existed." Miles uploaded the video to YouTube at 9:13 p.m., then shared it on a student forum at his school. He didn't expect anything. But within 90 minutes, the video had over 2,000 views. By midnight, that number rose to 18,000, and by the next morning, 7:45 a.m., the video had 45,600 views, nearly 9,000 shares on Twitter, and hundreds of comments spreading across Reddit, Tumblr, and even regional news sites. No one questioned the clarity of the footage. No one asked, what did she do wrong? Because the clip showed nothing but presence and fear. A black woman, unarmed, not resisting. A military-trained dog, not attacking. And 3 men with weapons and authority, behaving as if they were threatened by her calm. No voiceover was needed, no effects, because sometimes the truth doesn't need a narrator. It only needs someone who refuses to look away. Santa Clara had long been known as a peaceful place, free of racial issues, with police department reports logging fewer than 0.7% of complaints related to racial discrimination over the past 5 years. But that video, just over 3 minutes long, silently shattered that flawless image. And at that very moment, Hilda Anderson, though she had never heard of Miles and hadn't seen the video, became the bearer of a truth that the town had long refused to name. That truth was rising, not by accusation, but through a steady frame, unfaltering, unbowed. And from that second on, it no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to the public. It belonged to history. When Hilda Anderson woke up the next morning, before she touched her morning tea or checked the news, she already sensed that something had shifted, not in the weather, but in the air around her own home. Valor stood rigid by the front door, like a stone listening for something. And then she saw the mailbox. One word in blood-red paint, blotchy and slanted. Liar. The handwriting needed no signature. It needed no explanation. Because it wasn't an accusation, it was an act of violence, and it didn't come from the system, but from a community Hilda once believed was her own. Before she could react, a sharp crack came from the direction of the kitchen. She turned and saw the side window shattered, shards of glass stabbed into the wooden floor like blades. In the middle lay a rock wrapped in newspaper. Written in shaky but furious handwriting, "Shut up." Hilda didn't scream, didn't call the police. She simply walked over, carefully picked up the paper and the rock, placed them in a plastic bag, sealed it, and put it in the freezer, a habit Naomi used to preserve evidence against environmental damage. But not everyone harbored hate. When she opened the gate to check the fence, she found a bright bouquet of fresh sunflowers, the kind Naomi used to plant around the porch. There was no card, no message, but that anonymity made it even more sacred. Pinned to the iron gate was a small A5 sheet, written in pencil with a child's handwriting. "You didn't lie. You are a lion." The word lion was underlined in thick yellow marker. The writing was clumsy, but resolute. A child had seen and believed her. Yet the town was no longer a place of consensus. It was fracturing into pieces, spinning around that 3-minute and 12-second video. At the supermarket, the man who once called her a pillar of compassion now stared into his shopping cart like it held a secret exit. The woman who used to embrace her every Easter now turned away at the checkout, tugging her mask up like it might shield her from the truth. On local forums like Santa Talk, hundreds of comments erupted. Some defended her. If there wasn't a clip, they'd have said she attacked first. But many anonymous voices didn't hesitate to strike. If she didn't do anything wrong, why bring a big dog? What was she doing out at night? Trying to be seen? She just wants to make it on TV. These weren't just vulgar comments. They were splinters of an ideology, where the victim must prove they deserve to exist, where silence is no longer neutral, but complicit. Hilda began to notice the shifts in subtle details. The call from the charity center where she used to volunteer teaching English to immigrants was canceled due to budget cuts. The invitation to speak at her former university was rescinded as no longer appropriate for the current climate. The neighbor who once borrowed valor to guard her garden now locked her door before Hilda even walked past. But Hilda also realized this was no longer a confrontation between her and 3 officers. It had become a silent war between conscience and collective self-defense, between the courage to believe she was telling the truth and the comfort of continuing to believe everything was fine, still calm, still not something that could happen here. Santa Clara was not just divided. It was cut down the middle, across the seams, twisted by a single question. If the truth makes us uncomfortable, do we change or look away? And it was that question, not the rock, not the red paint, that made Hilda's heart sink heavier than ever. Because the deepest pain didn't come from strangers. It came from the familiar eyes that turned away in silence. The night in Santa Clara was as quiet as usual, but inside Hilda Anderson, everything felt taut, like a violin string wound too tight. The clock read 9:28 p.m. when the phone rang, a sound that shattered the fragile silence she had tried to build around herself after a day filled with stares, avoidance, and pity. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, but something urged her not to decline the call. She picked up, a deep male voice, clear and without hesitation. "Professor Anderson, this is Gavin Bennett. Deputy Chief, I'm calling you personally, not on behalf of the department." His name made her pause. Hilda had heard of Gavin through community forums, one of the very few black officers remaining in the Santa Clara force after years of cosmetic reforms. He was known for his silence, not out of cowardice, but observation. She'd seen him once at a vigil for a victim of mistaken police shooting in 2017, where he didn't speak, but was the last person to leave the memorial. "I've watched the video at least 14 times, he said. "Each time I see it, I recognize more clearly the things people prefer to deny. Elias's movements weren't reflex. They were boundary tests. Logan wasn't leading. He was orchestrating. And Riley is a product of this system." Hilda didn't reply right away. She simply nodded in silence, as if Gavin could somehow see the weariness in her through the telephone signal. "I've tracked many complaints over the past 4 years," he continued. "Most never made it into official records. Black individuals stopped, threatened by glances, by questions like where they were going, why, at what hour. No one was hit, no one arrested, just silence. But that silence is an undeclared policy. And your clip, it's not mine," Hilda interjected. "It belongs to the boy, Miles." Gavin paused for a beat, then gently said, "Then that boy has done what our system could not. And you're the only one in the video who held on to composure, dignity, and truth." He lowered his voice. "We're initiating an internal investigation. Ada Layla Carson from the district attorney's office has agreed to participate, but she won't proceed without a formal statement from a witness. And right now, the only person with enough standing is you." That sentence felt like a double-edged blade. She had never wanted to be a spokesperson for any movement. She had fought through her presence, through her steps, by refusing to bow, but never through a microphone or podium. Hilda closed her eyes, imagining Naomi standing in the middle of the mission trail path, dog tags in hand, her army coat flapping in the wind. "If you have to fight," she once said, "don't fight to prove you're right. Fight so they can't erase you from the map of the world." Hilda opened her eyes. Her voice wasn't raised, but it was firm. "You want to know if I'm willing to testify?" "Yes," Gavin replied. "Not because I want to," she said, "but because I can't allow them to erase one more person. If I step back, who will stand next?" Gavin took a deep breath on the line, the sound cracking slightly through the electromagnetic current. "This isn't a police call. This is a call from a black man inside the system to a black woman outside of it. We've been silent too long." The silence between them lasted nearly 10 seconds, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Then Gavin added, as if sealing a truth, "You've just become the spark, and you're not alone." The call ended in stillness, but Hilda understood that from that moment on, everything had changed. She was no longer merely the one being watched. She had become the ignition point in a system built on silence, now fracturing from within. That morning, Santa Clara shimmered under sunlight, like salt scattered on cobblestone streets. In front of City Hall, a crowd of curious residents gathered, standing behind hastily installed black iron barricades from the night before. Some were live streaming, some avoided the cameras. But every gaze was fixed on the black woman approaching the building's large wooden doors. The same woman who just a week earlier had been a familiar figure in the park and was now the center of a county-wide investigation. Hilda Anderson walked neither slowly nor hurriedly. Each of her steps was a balance between dignity and preparedness. She wore a deep blue blazer, the color Naomi once called the color of reason, and on her left chest gleamed a silver dog tag, not as an accessory, but as a personal emblem not bestowed by any institution. Valor was not allowed inside. By court order, for safety and order, even trained animals were barred from the courtroom. But Valor followed her to the third step, then sat down, his deep brown eyes never leaving the tightly closed door. He didn't bark, didn't whimper. He just sat there, silent as a cymbal. Inside the courtroom, the air was so heavy you could hear the rustle of cotton sleeves. More than 100 people filled the back rows: law students, local journalists, Hilda's former university professors, and neighbors who had once turned their faces at the supermarket. Outside, a large projection screen had been set up to display the drone footage filmed by Miles, a 3-minute and 12-second video now technically verified. No edits, no cuts, no overdubs. When the first image appeared, no one said a word. The projector's bluish glow washed over the room. Some covered their mouths, others bowed their heads. A man in a suit in the third row shook his head slowly, as if struggling to believe what his eyes were seeing. The prosecutor stepped forward and formally invited Hilda to testify. When she stood at the witness stand, the wood beneath her feet seemed to echo with the voices of souls never heard. No one rushed her. No one interrupted. She began to speak, without notes, without a script, armed only with memory and truth. I am Hilda Anderson, a resident of Santa Clara since 1988. I taught phonetics and language politics at the local university for 27 years before retiring. I live alone with my dog, Valor, trained in the military by my wife, Sergeant Naomi Anderson, who was killed in action in Syria in 2012. Her voice was not loud, not trembling. It had the tone of someone who once lectured to hundreds of students, but now addressed a society that needed to listen. In the 11 weeks leading up to the night this video was taken, I was followed at least 17 times by the same police cruiser. I documented the dates, times, locations. There was no yelling, no touching, just presence, persistent, silent, and designed to make me question my own reality. She paused, her eyes turning toward the police attorney taking notes. Then she spoke more slowly. That night, when Elias Carter raised his hand toward me, not to help, not to ask, but to reach for my wife's dog tag, as if it were evidence. When I said Gordich, Valor stepped forward just once. He didn't growl, he didn't bite, he simply stood between us. Because he wasn't trained to fight, he was trained to protect the survivor. A sniffle came from somewhere in the back. A woman dabbed at her eyes. The man beside her gently tightened his grip on her hand. I did not attack, Hilda concluded. I simply existed. And that, through the eyes of some, was threat enough. In the dense air of the courtroom, where muted light slid through the window onto the mahogany panel behind the judge's bench, the defense attorney stepped forward, leather shoes tapping a dry rhythm on the floor. He was tall, his hair slicked back with gel, and his smile thin as a stiletto hidden beneath layers of protocol. One hand held a stack of papers, the other rested on his chin, as if preparing to unmask a criminal. Only this time, the accused was a 65-year-old woman, a distinguished professor, and the widow of a soldier killed in action. Mrs. Anderson, he began, voice steady. I have only one brief question. Hilda did not blink. Her gaze was like an old mirror, reflecting exhaustion but showing no cracks. By wearing your wife's dog tag, outside your coat visibly, directly over your chest, do you consider that to be performative? Perhaps even provocative to others? A ripple of whispers spread across the courtroom. Journalists paused mid-type. A law intern slowly set down her fountain pen. But Hilda didn't blink. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She simply tilted her head slightly and answered slowly. I've worn that tag every day since 2012. Not so others can see it, but so I don't forget who I am, in a world constantly trying to remind me that I am no one. The answer didn't echo like a gavel strike, but it silenced the room like the calm after a storm. The defense attorney faltered. He looked as though he wanted to continue, but then stepped back, realizing he wasn't arguing with a witness. He was confronting a living memory. After the cross-examination, no one clapped, no one shouted, but something changed. The atmosphere. Instead of suspicion, the eyes in the room now carried a kind of understanding. Not everyone agreed, but everyone had been moved. The judge glanced at the clock, nodded gently, and signaled the jury to retire. In just 38 minutes, shorter than a high school class, they returned. Everyone rose, faces solemn as if they had stepped out of history itself. We, the jury, having considered all evidence and testimony, find Sergeant Logan Price, guilty. Officer Elias Carter, guilty. Cadet Matthew Riley, guilty. A whispered, "Oh my God," rose from the back row. But Hilda didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply stood taller, as though some invisible weight had just lifted from her back, leaving her, alone, facing a new reality. Logan slumped forward, both hands covering his face like trying to shield himself from the ruin of his career. Elias turned away, eyes once sharp as knives now hollow. Riley, the young recruit who had only ever known silence, bowed his head, lips pressed tight, as if finally understanding the cost of blind obedience. But Hilda didn't look at them. She no longer looked to the past. She turned toward the door, where Valor still sat, just as he had for the past 4 hours, patient, unmoving, his ears twitching slightly, as if hearing his name from far away. And as she stepped out of the courtroom, hands no longer trembling, shoulders no longer stooped, she knew with absolute clarity. Truth isn't spoken only in a courtroom. It is etched into the mind of a society, preserved by courage and, sometimes, by a gaze that never strays from the door, where a soul is still waiting to be called. The next morning, the sunlight over Santa Clara poured onto Mission Trail in a way that felt strangely familiar. The ocean breeze still carried its salty tang as it rustled through the eucalyptus trees. The shadows of the leaves still danced across the pale gravel path. There were no banners, no cameras, no one waiting to interview or report. But to Hilda Anderson, every stone beneath her feet now bore the imprint of something larger than herself, something that, in all her 65 years of life, she had never expected to carry: the legacy of daring to exist. She walked slowly, her wool coat slightly askew from the sea breeze. Beside her, Valor moved in silence, his gait calm and measured, like a creature that understood loyalty and resolve more deeply than any human ever could. He needed no leash, just Hilda's eyes. And those eyes, today, shone not with joy, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew they still had work to do. A young black woman in her 20s jogged toward them from the opposite direction. When she was just a few meters away, she suddenly stopped, hands on her knees, breathing hard. Then she looked up at Hilda, not with surprise, but with the deep reverence of someone who once believed she was the only one, but now knew she was just one link in a long chain of people who had dared to say, "No." "Thank you for not backing down," she said, her voice trembling more from emotion than exertion. Hilda didn't smile like a hero, nor did she pat the girl on the shoulder like a mentor. She simply nodded, enough for the words of thanks not to fall into silence. In her eyes, something had just ended, and at the same time, just begun. That morning, she received over 2,000 emails from former students, from parents, from strangers who had never met her, but said they wept watching the trial. One wrote, "I'm a postal worker in Indiana. You showed me how to stand tall in silence." A single mother in Newark sent a photo of her daughter wearing a paper dog tag with Naomi written on it like a badge of honor. At the Santa Clara Police Department, Logan Price submitted his resignation, along with a 7-page handwritten confession. Elias Carter was suspended for 18 months without pay, while Matt Riley was ordered to undergo 12 months of retraining, not just in procedure, but in American history and the role of unconscious bias in law enforcement. Gavin Bennett was nominated by the City Council to lead the Police Reform Task Force, the first black person in 43 years to hold such a position in Santa Clara. But to Hilda, the most important thing had nothing to do with titles or punishments. What mattered most was that morning, when she walked into the park, she no longer had to glance over her shoulder at the sound of a police cruiser's engine. She no longer had to avoid her neighbor's eyes. And on the chalkboard outside the cafe at the corner, someone had written in white chalk, "She didn't shout. She just existed." And that was enough. When she returned home, she unpinned the dog tag from her coat and laid it on the table next to Naomi's photograph. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting the tag's shadow on the wooden surface like a sacred emblem. Hilda spoke softly, not sure whether to herself, to Naomi, or to the future. No one is born to be a symbol, but sometimes we are called to live like one. The fight didn't end with a verdict, and she knew well, injustice doesn't crumble on its own. It erodes, step by step, glance by glance, word by unyielding word. And she had chosen to keep walking, not quietly, but with purpose. In the end, something had begun to change. Join us in sharing stories that matter by liking and subscribing. And don't forget to turn on notifications to start each morning with powerful lessons and genuine empathy.